Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 38, Episode 8, The Battles of Hedgeley Moor and Hexham, 1464, Part 2. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. John Neville probably marched along the north bank of the River Tyne, along Carrel Gate. This route put Bywell Castle under threat, but we do not hear of Henry leaving, although he must have if this was the line of march and other alternatives still put Bywell under threat. In his march west, Neville probably crossed the Tyne at Corbridge, or perhaps Bywell. Both had extant Roman bridges, and so came upon the Lancastrian camp from the east or northeast. If he came from the north, he would therefore have trapped the Lancastrians with their backs to the Devil's Water, a tributary of the Tyne. In the late 19th century, Henry Barrett placed the battle close to the Devil's Water, south of Linnell's Bridge and the road to Hexham. Dorothy Charlesworth, however, placed it instead on Swallowship Hill, approximately 1 mile away to the north-east. The reason for this debate on the exact location of the battle is important. Charlesworth would have Neville attack from the east above the bridge, with the Lancastrians at the more strategically sound Swallowship Hill. Worcester's Annales state that the battle was fought on a hill 1 mile from Hexham, although others place it on level ground between Hexham and the Tyne. Henry's yearbook called the site a place called Livels on the Devil's Water. Others call the Livels a fair plain. This evolved to be the site around Lennolds, probably Linnell's, where in 1778 the lines of entrenchment are still to be seen. Gentleman's Magazine 48, November 1778, page 507. This letter to the editor by a Mr. Y.H. of Newcastle criticised the Welsh traveller and naturalist Thomas Pennant's tour, presumably his tour in Scotland, published in 1774, that, regarding the Battle of Hexham, he made the common mistake that the battle was fought on the level ground below Hexham. The author was assured that the battle happened at a place called Lennolds, south-west of Hexham, and that the lines of entrenchment are still to be seen. Barrett places the Lancastrian camp close to Linnell's Bridge, with their back to the Devil's Water. The bridge dates to 1530, but must have been the site of an earlier bridge, or at least a crossing point in the Devil's Water, whose steep banks precluded an easy crossing elsewhere, a choke point, and a site which controlled access further to the west. It was the last obstacle between Newcastle and Hexham, which was still held by Lancastrian forces. This traditional site for the battle is, however, severely flawed. If selected to prevent troops from fleeing the Lancastrian cause when the enemy appeared, would be its only positive. Otherwise, it's trapped the Lancastrians in the meadow with the river to their backs and with only one point of exit. The other sides were blocked by a steeply wooded slope. Further, it did not command any crossing of the Devil's Water. The Lancastrians could not escape over the river to the east if the need arose. It was also south of the bridge, and Neville could have bypassed this position with ease, and detaching only a small holding force, then crossing the Devil's Water at another point before moving on towards Hexham, and so cutting Somerset off from Hexham, his line of retreat. In addition to Linnell's Bridge, there were two other fords of the Devil's Water north of the traditional position of the battlefield, south of Linnell's Bridge. This led Charlesworth to suggest Swallowship Hill as a better and more logical site for the battlefield, quote, the obvious site for the battle to have been fought, unquote. The hill commanded all three crossing points of the Devil's Water at Linnell's Bridge, and the two fords north of it, both of which were directly west of the hill. The hill also provided a vantage point over a wide area across which the Yorkists would need to advance. This was tactically a much better site, and more likely than the identified one by most as the site of the battle. Given the widespread flight of the Lancastrians after the battle, actually having an escape route by which to flee, including across the Devil's Water, which the traditional site does not afford, also makes Charlesworth's suggestion more likely. Despite this sighting of the battle and the Lancastrian camp on much better ground, the battle was still a brief affair, and the Lancastrians must have, again, fled at the first Yorkist attack. The Yorkists must have once again outnumbered the Lancastrians, perhaps heavily. Charlesworth argues, probably rightly, that Neville must have progressed most of the way to the battle site on May the 14th, and therefore came upon the Lancastrians at Swallowship Hill early on the morning of the 15th of May. Her reasoning is that, since Somerset was captured and executed before the day was out, there had to be time for him to fight the battle, lose, flee, be captured, and then be executed at Hexham. There is also no report of casualties on the field, which also implies a rapid flight by the Lancastrians. Barrett, too, is dismissive of the fight. It can hardly be designated a battle. The Lancastrians probably once more scattered at the first Yorkist charge. They crossed the Devil's Water in their plight, and this makes Barrett's location problematic, since there was no ford south of the bridge, where he places the Lancastrian camp. Charlesworth's location, however, has two additional fords, which would allow the Lancastrians to escape eastwards towards Hexham, some 2 miles away. Other Lancastrians, however, clearly fled west. It was a flight in all directions, and every man for themselves. Duke Henry was wounded and was captured 1 mile north of the battlefield at a small house, now known as the Duke's House, and apparently with some 15th century features still extant. Even though King Henry was probably absent from the battle, some of his pages were overtaken in possession of the king's bicocket cap of estate. Henry's helmet was found at Bywell Castle. Brief Latin Chronicle 179. What funds he had, perhaps £2,000, were also captured in the flight in possession of William Tailbois, Earl of Kyme. The flight from the battle was in all directions. Several sites due west of the battlefield are associated with the defeat at Hexham. Barrett rightly rejects the associations of Queen Margaret of Anjou with the battle. She was already in France. She sailed from Banbur for Sluis in August 1643 after the siege of Norham Castle, although Worcester's Annales 448 states it was in April, which must be in error. There was, however, a Queen's Cup and Queen's Cave associated with her and the battle in early records, which are due west of Linnell's Bridge in West Dipton Wood. They cannot have been originally connected with the Battle of Hexham, however. There are sites more firmly associated with the pursuit to the west, however, although the retreating forces would need to cross the steep West Dipton burn multiple times in a flight in that direction. Nonetheless, there was a butcher's bank and a guard's lane near Dipton Bridge, which may have been named after associations with the defeat. Worcester's Annales 779 states that only 500 Lancastrians faced 10,000 Yorkists at Hexham. Although this makes some sense of the rapid flight of the Lancastrians, this can't have been the case, as there was no reason for the Lancastrians to stay and fight at such odds, unless, that is, they were taken by surprise at the speed of Neville's advance. This seems unlikely, however. A battle was expected. 10,000 men also seems too large a number of men for Neville to have had. Hawkesworth's chronicle gives Neville 4,000 men, slightly less than he had at Hedgeley Moor, but also states that Somerset gathered a great people to the north of the county, although without providing a number. These may have been commoners, and Warkworth states they did not stand when the Yorkists charged. Unlike at Hedgeley Moor, Neville's pursuit was not hampered by his need to be anywhere else urgently, and he could pursue the fleeing Lancastrians mercilessly, which it seems his men did. The list of those captured, trying to flee, and how far afield they were captured and later executed is long indeed. After Somerset was captured, he was executed. Barrett dates this to May 9th, but it was probably late on the 15th. Lord Hungerford was also captured, as was Lord Ross. They were transported to Newcastle and executed there on May 17th. So too were Sir Thomas Wentworth, Sir Thomas Hussey, Sir John Finderne, William Tailbois, and Sir Ralph Grey. Grey suffered the ignominy of being degraded from his knighthood before his execution. His spurs were hacked off, his sword broken, and his shield symbolically reversed. Grey had deserted the Yorkist cause after the capture of Alnwick Castle in 1463. He had expected to become its governor, but was only made constable. Sir John Ashley was made governor, and out of pique, Grey switched sides. He was therefore reserved unusual punishment. Stowe's Annales 715 also names Sir Thomas Fulford beheaded at Hexham. In all, 30 leading Lancastrians were executed immediately following the battle and in its aftermath. Ralph Grey was not present at Hexham, but holed up in Bamburgh Castle, and he tried to continue resistance. It was futile. Somerset was dead, Henry was in hiding, and Margaret was in France. The Lancastrian strongholds of Hexham, Tyndale, Langley, and Bywell, as well as Alnwick, Dunstanburgh, and Bamburgh, were all in Yorkists' hands by June 1464. That by itself was a rapid capitulation. Hexham had been fought on May 15th, and all those sites were in Yorkist hands within a month. For the first time since 1460, when Edward came to the throne, all of England was under his control. He would not be seriously challenged until the Earl of Warwick changed his allegiance from the Yorkist cause to the Lancastrians in 1469. An aside, Sir Thomas Malory and the battles of Hedgeley Moor and Hexham, when the Wars of the Roses broke out in 1455, Thomas Malory, author of the highly influential La Morte d'Arthur, was already in prison. One of the peculiar aspects of Malory's life and career is that he seems to have spent long periods in prison during the Wars of the Roses, accused of rape, pillage, and attempted murder. This is disquieting for the author of what would become the most influential work of chivalric literature. Indeed, we know Malory finished his opus magnus when he was in prison, probably in 1469. Malory was still in prison in 1461 when Edward IV won the Battle of Towton and took the English throne. Mallory was pardoned and released soon after, however, and served in the northern campaigns from October 1462 onwards. He was present at the siege of Alnwick Castle in November 1462, with William Neville, probably his patron. He was therefore probably also involved in the sieges of Banbury and Dunstanburgh castles also, until the surrender of Henry, Duke of Somerset, in December. William Neville died in January 1463, and his command then passed to his brothers, Richard and John. John was created Earl of Northumberland in May 1463. In all likelihood, therefore, Mallory continued to serve with them in the north until the campaign was successfully concluded in May or June 1464. As such, he may have served at both the battles of Hedgeley Moor and Hexham under John Neville, as well as the pursuit of the Lancastrians and the taking of the Lancastrian castles until June 1464. The next known fact of Mallory's life is from September 1464, when he witnessed the marriage of John Fielding and Helen Walsh, probably his niece. In 1466 or 1467, a grandson, Nicholas, was born to Thomas's son, Robert Mallory. However, by July 1468, Mallory was back in prison. He was explicitly excluded from a general pardon by Edward IV at that time, and in prison he would remain. He was excluded from a pardon again in February 1470, and may have died in prison in March 1471. During that final prison term, he completed and published La Morte d'Arthur in Edward's 9th year, so between March 1469 and March 1470. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.